Hey everyone, I got this message from a follower, which you can see on the screen here. It says, "Hello Ryan, I would love to see you do a video on the Driver Inc. model and hiring practice that has taken over the commercial motor vehicle industry in Ontario. In a nutshell, it is where an individual is coerced or given belief to register their own company to get hired by a company, and then that company then uses them as an independent contractor. The purpose of doing so is to avoid paying the Canada Pension Plan, employment insurance, and Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, WSIB insurance, which ultimately strips worker rights to benefits while evading taxes. I currently work for blank. I've redacted that out to protect this person's identity. Most of these poor guys work on the side of highways and don't qualify for benefits should they get sick or hurt. WSIB determines who is an employee based on who owns the truck and who pays for the gas and who chooses the route. And by all means, these guys are employees by their standards. They don't own the truck. They don't pay for the gas. They don't pay for vehicle insurance, vehicle maintenance. They aren't leasing the vehicle from the company. It is sad to see so many hardworking people being taken advantage of. And the worst part is they are all in fear of losing their job to go against their employers. These employees, once again, don't qualify for benefits as an intentionally misclassified employee that have no tax write-offs to balance their HST submissions on top of having no benefits. The Canadian Trucking Association has been trying to bring this issue to the government's attention, but they are focusing on the transportation goods part of the industry instead of the other industries that this issue has impacted. So this question about who is an employee and who's an independent contractor, and then there's this sort of like concept separately. Actually, I'll show you over here on the list. There's a separate concept called a dependent contractor, which sort of exists in between the two. This is something that comes up across a lot of industries across all of Canada, really, not just in Ontario, but it matters quite a bit, as you can see from this person's story, because when you are an employee, you have a whole bunch of rights, and the employer has obligations and they owe you certain things. And that's exactly why a lot of employers will try to classify a worker as an independent contractor when in reality, based on the nature of the relationship, they're actually an employee. So this question comes up a lot. And in fact, at ontario.ca, they have an explanation here, sort of a guide to the Employment Standards Act. Now, just because this explanation appears on the ontario.ca website doesn't itself make it law. It's obviously a reliable source and it helps you understand the situation. The actual law is found in the Employment Standards Act, and that's a very long, complicated document we're not going to get into today. But the explanation of that, for example, when you take a look at this guide, it says how to tell who is an employee. The relationship between an individual and the business or person they're working for determines whether the individual is an employee and entitled to protections under the ESA. An individual may be considered an employee under the ESA when at least some of the following describes the relationship. The work the individual performs is an important part of the business. The business decides what the individual is to do, how much the individual will be paid, where and when the work is performed. The business provides the individuals with tools, equipment, or materials to perform the work. The individual cannot subcontract their work to someone else, and the business has the right to suspend, dismiss, or otherwise discipline the individual. So one thing I want to mention is when there are disputes between employers and employees that escalate either to, let's say, a complaint to the Ministry of Labor or going to court and suing your employer or what have you, you can only pick one or the other. And this is really, really important to keep in mind, because let's say you are in a situation like this and things are getting bad and you call the Ministry of Labor and you make a complaint. Well, in doing so, you may have just lost the right. Well, you would have lost the right to go to court and then litigate that issue. Now, there's some provisions that allow you to, like, within certain timeframes, you can withdraw that and then go the other route. But it is very much an either or situation. And a lot of people don't know that. So you have to get proper legal advice before you decide, is proceeding in, let's say, a courtroom, whether it's small claims court or superior court, hiring, you've probably seen those advertisements from lawyers on billboards and buses saying like, hey, don't sign anything if you've been fired. Contact us, we'll help you for free, or we won't charge you anything unless we win something for you, like what we call contingency fee lawyers. So you've seen those ads everywhere, and typically what those lawyers are trying to do is figure out if there's a way to go to court to get you a result. But sometimes, depending on the advice you get, it may be better to go through the Ministry of Labor, or it may be better to go through court. I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages. We're not going to get into that today. The focus of this video, again, is just understanding employee versus independent contractor versus dependent contractor. And as you can see from this person's email, this is something that does get abused by employers, and it looks like it's a problem in the commercial trucking industry or commercial motor vehicle industry. I did do some Googling on that, and that person is right. They go on to explain how there are people in the industry in organized groups that are trying to bring this, what they call driver Inc. issue to more of the forefront. But moving on with that, let's look at what the Ontario website is saying about how to tell if someone is an independent contractor. An independent contractor is someone who is in business for themselves. An individual may be considered an independent contractor and not covered by the ESA when at least some of the following applies. The business can end the individual's contract for services, but cannot discipline the individual. And the individual has the opportunity to make a profit and has a risk of losing money from the work. And the individual determines how, when, or where the work is performed. And the individual decides whether to subcontract some of the work. So, you probably one of the easiest to understand, simplest, most common examples of this is like you hire, a wedding photographer to show up at your wedding, right? This person is self-employed through and through. They are not your employee for that day or anything like that. You're hiring them to basically, to do this, provide this service, which they show up with the camera that belongs to them, which they purchased. They will tell you whether or not they're available that day, and they can decline your request if they want. You can go find yourself another wedding photographer. So that's different if, let's say, like you owned, I don't know, a media company and you hired a photographer on some kind of salary, and you're the person that decides what they do from 9 to 5, and there's more of an entrenched relationship there. So I think this is a pretty straightforward concept for most people to understand. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand it, but it does matter. Like, these distinctions do matter when it comes to calculating things like, what am I entitled to if the relationship ends, and that kind of thing. So the Ontario website has an example here where it says Faria works as a customer service representative for a sales business. She must work Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the business's office. She uses the business's telephones and computers. She's paid $25.50 per hour. Her employment contract does not have an end date, although her employer can fire or discipline her for poor performance. Her employment contract states that she is an independent contractor, so she does not receive overtime pay, vacation pay, or public holiday pay. Faria thinks she might actually be an employee and may be entitled to overtime pay, vacation pay, and public holiday pay. She files a claim with the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. An employment standards officer investigates her claim. If you've been watching my channel, I have a whole bunch of other videos, animated videos, videos that have much more editing than this one, which is sort of more off the cuff, where I go into the details of exactly how employment standards officers get involved, what their role is, how they can enforce orders that they make. It's very, like, that's much more, we get into the weeds with that. But let's just talk about this example for a moment. An employment standards officer investigates her claim. The officer looks at the relationship between Faria and the sales business and finds that she is an employee. It does not matter that Faria signed an employment contract stating that she is an independent contractor, because the facts show that she is an employee. The employment standards officer orders the sales business to pay Faria the overtime pay, vacation pay, and public holiday pay that she is entitled to as an employee, and orders the employer to issue wage statements to keep records. Also, I have a separate video on how overtime pay works. There's another video on how vacation pay works, and there's another video on how public holiday works, and that's all Ontario-based. So understanding this distinction is important. I realize up until now, I don't think I really visited it that much. But one thing I want to do, and this is sort of like the more interesting part of the video for me, is I want to show you what lawyers are doing behind the scenes when you actually ask them sort of these complicated legal questions where I'm like, am I an independent contractor? Am I an employee? Like, am I a dependent contractor? Whatever that means. When a lawyer gives you an answer to stuff like that, you want to kind of understand how they're coming to that answer, not just that, like, okay, well, this person's a lawyer and this is what they told me, so I'm just going to take it on blind faith. People do that a lot with, like, let's say doctors as well. It's just like, well, depending on the kind of person you are, you might just take whatever your doctor tells you as gospel, or whatever your lawyer tells you as just fact. But it is important really to understand how they're coming to these answers and what tools are being used. So for example, let's say I wanted to do a little bit of research on whether or not somebody is a dependent contractor, if they're falling somewhere in this like sort of middle ground over here. What you could do, and I can sort of like show you the steps over here by going back to this website over here. This is a website, maybe again, if you follow a channel like this, maybe you've seen this website a lot. It's called Canlii, CANLII.org. And this is where you can actually look up decisions that courts and tribunals have made right across Canada. There's a difference between a court and a tribunal. I don't want to get too technical, but my point is these are legal decisions that judges and people who decide legal cases have made, and they get published here. And that's important because when they get published here, they form part of our common law. They form how people are supposed to interpret what the law says in this country, right? So if I was so curious, I could type in something like dependent contractor. How do I spell dependent contractor? Yeah, with an A. Sure, great. I'm losing my mind. And then I could let's say I want to drill down a little bit further on this issue. And let's say, look, I've got 25,567 cases that have shown up. I'm not going to sit there reading all of them, and I don't know how to make sense of all of them, and you probably don't want to do that. So just so that you understand what kind of legal research your lawyer is doing behind the scenes and how they're getting these answers, I'm going to show you a few tips and tricks you can do right at home. Again, this is just for educational purposes. It's not advice for your specific situation. I always have to say that. So you can go to, let's say, cases over here, and you can say, I am interested in just the province of Ontario. And if you want to do a little neat trick over here, I just want to see appeal courts. Now, why is that important? Well, that's because we have a hierarchy of courts across this country, right? You might already know that. Supreme Court's all the way at the top. What they decide, everybody else in the country has to follow. But even within provinces, like in Ontario, if the Ontario Court of Appeal makes a decision about an issue, every court below that, the Superior Court, the Small Claims Court, they have to approach similar situations and apply the law in the exact same way that the Ontario Court of Appeal has directed them to do. That's why, out of those, let's say 25,000 cases that have mentioned the words, dependent contractor, I'm most interested in these 456 cases here. But of course, again, I'm not going to sit and read 456 cases. But what's great about this is that Canlii, this free public resource, you can sort by relevance, right? So typically what will happen is they'll show you the result that seems to be the most important or the most authoritative on this question, right? So I can click on that and I can actually go into the case. And again, is the average person going to sit here and read through this long legal jargon written, by a panel of judges? And like maybe you're a law student and you're sort of like being trained into how to read some of this stuff, and you get really into the weeds with it. But I do believe that like if I, by watching videos like this, just being walked through the process, most people can sit down and figure out, okay, well, here's a case talking about a similar situation, and here's how the judges have sort of thought about it. I'll give you an example of how easy that could be. I just kind of scrolled down and I wanted to see where the words dependent contractor showed up. And I could just do a little control find. Obviously, this case is all about dependent contractors, so it showed up 33 times. But I wanted to look at, sorry, give me a second here and we'll browse through some of the, there we go. Look at this. This section says distinguishing between employees and dependent contractors, right? RHH submit, again, like this stuff is written in a way that it's not super accessible, but like when they say something like RHH submits that exclusivity and economic dependence are hallmarks of the dependent contractor, what they're basically saying is like one of the party's lawyers is raising an argument that says that XYZ, blah, blah, blah. We want the judge to look at the situation this way. That's all they're trying to say. And then, they'll come to their conclusions. The court will explain what they concluded. Having concluded that there's an intermediate category, there's this category between employees and independent contractors called dependent contractors. Having concluded that this category exists, I also conclude that the legal principles applicable to distinguishing between employees and independent contractors apply equally to the distinction between employees and dependent contractors. In this way, the dependent contractor category arises as a carve-out from the non-employment category and does not affect the range of the employment category. So again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds with a video like this where, I'm not trying to turn this into a law school training session. What I'm trying to say is anybody with an internet connection can go to CanLII. You can search up terms that may apply to your situation. You can find cases that are relevant to those terms, and you can look at situations where courts have thought about these concepts. So here, just even by itself, I mean, if we were to go on to this, we would get further into like when a worker is considered dependent on the employer and not. And you can see that we talk about things like exclusivity, right? Is this person exclusively working for this one employer? Let's say you go to this situation where this person sent me this message and you have a driver who is, let's say they have their own registered business because that's what they were told to do. And they only do work for that one company. Like every transportation related activity they're doing all day is just for this one company. Okay, well, let's say the company says, well, you're an independent contractor because we say so. But the worker is saying, no, you decide what I do with my day. You provide me with all the tools of the job. I'm an employee. And at the very least, I'm a dependent contractor because I'm working exclusively for you, right? So when we get into these sort of like technical, like, well, do we look at it this way or that way? That's exactly what the case law is here for. Just to take a step back, courts and tribunals and case law, it exists so that there's somebody in place who can take the letter of the law over here, where we're talking about things like the Employment Standards Act, and apply it to situations in a way that actually decides specific people's disputes and specific companies' employment disputes. That's why we have these tribunals. They're there to interpret the law and give some sort of clarity. And then when they give those reasons are there for everybody to read. You don't have to be a lawyer to read those things. So the other thing to keep in mind while I'm on the topic of the common law is that rights and obligations that people have can come straight from the common law. And what I mean from the common law, what I mean is when a judge makes a decision about something that isn't clearly regulated or governed by some piece of legislation like the Employment Standards Act or the Canada Labor Code or whatever, right? Like if you have some aspect of interpreting a situation or a right or what have you, where there isn't a clear answer in the written legislation that the politicians have come up with, well, the answer has to come from somewhere, and that's what we get. That's where we look to the common law, right? This is law that goes back hundreds of years, all the way to early England, and we look at how situations were interpreted. Courts have gone back to the 1800s, to the 1600s. It's crazy. Like there's usually an answer for almost everything. But again, I don't want to get too far off track. I want to spend the first half of this video sort of looking at the practical, like Ontario resources that you can find, which deals with situations like what the message that I received. But at the same time, I also wanted to give you sort of like an insight into like how to think like a lawyer and how to analyze a question like a lawyer. So if you have like an employment related situation, or forget the employment law, if you have any sort of like legal issue you're coming up with, you're coming into contact with in your life, whether it's like landlord tenant board stuff or whatever, just keep this in mind that like there are like lawyers don't have this like crystal ball where they just pull all this information out of and answers out of it. These answers come from legislation. So thanks for watching. And if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out and I'll see if I can make a video about it. Thanks.